Thank you, Steve. It's great to be here, and I thank you for all the work that you and your committee, as well as CRS and this great university have done to bring us all together. I have to say great university because I served for 12 years on the Board of Trustees here, but I believe what I say. What can the church do to defend religious freedom? I think this is obviously a linchpin question for all of us gathered here today. And the importance of the issue, I think, is beyond dispute. I recall the 2010 Church in Need report on violations of religious freedom around the world, and which they pointed out that 75 of the 100 persons who were put to death around the world for religious belief were Christian. But if it were only one, or if it were none, the Holy See, if there were no Christians who were put to death, the Holy See and the Catholic Church would have, and the church here in the United States would have a responsibility to respond to violations of religious freedom throughout the world. That's our role. That's part of our own vocation. And while we are, of course, primarily spiritual because we're here to preach Jesus Christ, the fact is that there is nothing human that's foreign to the gospel, and that means that all of us, no matter what may be our background, if we are Christian, we always have to be united not only with our brothers and sisters in Christianity, but to all our brothers and sisters in working to bring an end to religious intolerance, as Cardinal Dolan spoke so very eloquently in his keynote speech. I have from Steve Kalecki 2 pages of instructions on what I'm supposed to tell you to do. I don't know that I'm going to give them all these instructions, Steve, but I am going to say that that you have already heard from the Iraq, Nigeria, and Cuba panels, so I've just done that, Steve. And I'm going to mention the fact that we have not 3, but as you can see, 2 panelists. Unfortunately, Jean Elstein, who had planned to be here and committed herself to being here, has had some health problems. Her husband called yesterday to say that she today is in the hospital for tests. So keep her in your prayers because she's a great lady who's done an awful lot of great things in the field of academia and in how academia can make such a big difference in the lives of people and of nations. So we send her our prayers and we thank the Lord that she's going to get the help that she needs. Now, what we're going to do is this. We're going to have about 15 minutes from each one of our panelists, and that they will be followed by a question and answer period. I will give you about a 2 or 3 minute warning. When you see my hand slip up a piece of paper, that's what I'm saying. And with the question and answers, I'd ask you please to be brief and come to the point, and so that we'd have as much time for as many people as possible to speak. I think we all know that the church has had a long history of participation in these issues on the level of teaching, beginning with the Second Vatican Council through John Paul II and Benedict XVI. We also know that the church has been present in various roles I've had in my life as a priest. I've had the opportunity to be an instrument for such things as, I recall one time a Methodist bishop was in jail and tortured in Bolivia, and the World Council of Churches contacted the Holy See, and it was through the Holy See that bishop was able to be freed for the persecution and torture that he was undergoing. And we can name these situations time and time and time again. The Archbishop Choulicat and Archbishop Vigano are testimonies themselves to the way the church at the level of the Holy See and the diplomatic service continues to be present. Our own conference has done the same, and we believe that there's a greater and greater collaboration in the Catholic Church to address these issues in a very, very real and committed, concerted way. So we have a tradition of teaching, we have a tradition of witness, we have a tradition of involvement, and we want to have always a tradition of solidarity with all those who, like us, are committed to this very important topic. And without any further words from me, I'd like to introduce to you Mary Ann Cusimano Love, who is Associate Professor of International Relations in the Politics Department of the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. She's a longtime friend of mine, and we've been involved in many, many panels together. We both serve on the Committee for International Justice and Peace, and she's a person who's written widely. She's on top of all these issues. She's a consultant to government issues on special kinds of projects, and an extraordinarily capable and brilliant speaker, and a mother of three. Mary Ann, please take over.
Thank you, Bishop Murphy, and thank you all for being here today to discuss these important issues and for all the important work you all do on these issues, because I'm looking around the room seeing so many people who are very active and very, very helpful in moving these issues forward. In my comments this afternoon, I'm going to suggest that we must move from International Religious Freedom 1.0 to International Religious Freedom 2.0, the next generation of religious freedom advocacy and policy. We must create a stronger and longer coalition of unlikely partners working together to promote international religious freedom. The church has a key role to play in this, and has many gifts to contribute in moving from that 1.0 to 2.0 next generation of religious freedom policy. And particularly the church has what I'm going to discuss as 3 I's: ideas, institutions, and imagination that we can contribute to this movement. I want to suggest that there are 2 faces of international religious freedom issues that are unrecognized. One is that international religious freedom is a woman's rights issue. It's a woman's issue, as well as a security issue. And we've heard much about the latter today, so I may say less about the security issue, just a little at the end. But we must invite and work with new, unlikely coalition partners in these fields of women's rights and security issues in order to better promote and protect international religious freedom and to save lives and build peace. So first, the Catholic Church played a very important role in changing U.S. foreign policy toward international religious freedom. And I'm sure John Carr will have a lot to say on that, on the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, and the way in which the church worked tirelessly to build a really unprecedented coalition across religious lines, across political lines, to get the law that we have now. That was, when I'm referring to International Religious Freedom 1.0, that was the sea change in policy, getting that landmark legislation passed. Establishing this law and the structures that the law created, USERF, the International Religious Freedom, when you hear me talk about IRF, that's the designation of the office in the State Department designated to work on that, the ambassador at large for international religious freedom, all these structures that the law created, as well as the 2 annual reports, one by the State Department and one by the USERF, on these issues. Now, these were a huge accomplishment. It created the legal basis for discussion and promotion of these issues. It created a staff and a budget to do so. It provides the informational basis needed to make policy. And it provides the opportunity to keep these issues on the radar screen. So you know, twice a year at least, you're going to hear from policymakers and people who will have to respond to these issues in these reports. And that's huge. It's a very, very important step forward. But these instruments, as we all know, alone do not make policy. Reports alone do not change repressive regimes. But without these reporting functions, the U.S. and other governments would be operating blind, making policy in the dark without vetted, trusted information that's well vetted on religious freedom violations. Without the law, the policymakers would not be forced by law to consider the effect of their policies on religious freedom and to have to justify it in those terms. Policy needs an information base, and acknowledging the problems is the first step towards solving them. The invitation to work with other groups across religious divides and across political divides was the great accomplishment of IRF 1.0. That bipartisan support that was built to support the law and its financing was key. However, that was then, and this is now. And in the 1990s, in an era of a balanced budget and budget surpluses, it was easier to keep that coalition together. That is not the era we are in now. And we've seen the defraying, the undercutting, undermining of that coalition just last year, and how difficult it was to get the USERF Commission reappointed in these scarce resource times. So we have to work anew to strengthen and broaden the IRF coalition to move international religious freedom forward. Currently, and this is something I argue repeatedly in the working groups we've had within the State Department and others on how to do outreach to civil society and religious actors and factors in foreign policy, currently international religious freedom internally in the United States government and externally is a one-legged stool. And with the first generation of religious freedom, we have put too much pressure on this one office within the Department of State to carry the water on religious freedom and other, really all issues relating to religion, to carry the water on those issues within the U.S. government writ large, and also internationally. We don't have other partners who are similarly set up with religious freedom offices. So that needs to change. We need to expand that coalition within the U.S. government, within the United States, as well as internationally. And it is changing. The Canadians and others are interested in starting their own religious freedom offices, which would be wonderful. It would take the frame off of this being only or exclusively an American agenda with the connotations of American imperialism or imposition that may come with that. So that is a really important move forward, but there's a lot of work to be done on that. To do that, to move forward to the next generation, I'd submit that there are two stories, these two faces of international religious freedom that we have to tell, and the three gifts, the three eyes that the church brings to the task. First, international religious freedom has a face. This issue has a face, and it is the face of a woman. When extremists bomb houses of worship, who are underneath those bombs and rubble? We know, social science and demographics tell us, that women are more religious than men by almost any benchmark or any study that you use to look at these issues. Whether you measure belief in God, belief in a supreme being, attendance at religious services, personal prayer, religious practices, transmission of faith values to children, raising the family within a faith tradition, by any of these benchmarks or any of these studies, women consistently rank as more religious than men across time, across cultures, across studies. These results are so consistent and so accepted that the academic debates have tended to focus on why women are more religious than men, not on whether. And so these questions of nurture, nature, etc. But because of that, because of women's religious nature, we know that religious repression, persecution, and violence affects women most. When churches are bombed, who are the people praying in those churches, hurt and killed? Women. When people are forced to flee religious persecution as refugees or internally displaced persons, who are those refugees and IDPs? Predominantly women and children. When the educational activities of faith-based NGOs are shut down or curtailed, when religious organizations like CRS or Caritas find their work curtailed or banned because of their religious affiliation, who is hurt most? The women who make up the bottom billion of the world's poorest citizens are hurt most. 70% of the bottom billion, of the poorest of the poor, are women and girls. 70% of youth not in school are women and girls. Girls are 3 times more likely to be malnourished. When faith-based organizations are curtailed in their service, women and girls are harmed. But not only are women primarily the victims of international religious freedom violations, they are also responding at the front lines to these violations. We see in our audience women who are head of NGOs, like Carolyn Wu, refugees helping and working to advocate for other refugees, women teachers and healthcare workers, women lawyers reporting the violations and pressuring governments for change. But the female face of international religious freedom is often not seen. When victims of religious persecution or violence are counted, we often do the counting in some interesting ways. We count, are they Christian or are they Muslim? Are they part of the security forces or are they citizens? Women are not counted because in too many parts of the world, women simply do not count as fully human. The female face of this issue is important for understanding what the Catholic Church can contribute to international religious freedom policy. And again, I remind you, these are these three I's. First, in the realm of institutions. As the largest single religious denomination and one endowed with vast and rich institutions, the Catholic Church has vast institutional depth which can be put in service of international religious freedom. Shortly put, we have a very deep bench. Even in countries where Catholics are minorities or are barely present at all, such as Afghanistan, we've already heard how our Catholic relief and development organizations respond to all on the basis of need, not creed. So we have a presence in many countries, even beyond our people in the pews and parishes. When persecuted Iraqis were driven from Iraq, the Catholic Church knew what was happening and pressured policymakers to act on behalf of Iraqi refugees of all religious persuasions. As actors in countries where religious freedom is often violated, the Church can provide credible early warning information needed by policymakers to understand the on-the-ground conditions affecting populations at risk. And as very rich transnational advocacy networks, we can raise the voices of those persecuted and at-risk populations in ways that don't further put them at risk, but can do so at a distance from other foreign capitals and places and forums. Secondly, in the realm of ideas, the Catholic Church has been only a recent convert to promoting religious freedom. For those of us born after Vatican II, this is important to remember. Prior to Vatican II, the Catholic Church had often violated religious freedom under the mantra, "Error has no rights." And we can look through many historical moments when the Church was the oppressor rather than the champion of religious freedom. Now, this may seem an awkward and impolitic thing to mention at a conference supported by the Catholic Church here at the Catholic University of America. But I assure you, as a committed Catholic and as a professor here at this university, it is not impolitic to remind us of that. The Catholic Church and the USCCB have been very, very active in promoting religious freedom and were key coalition partners in passing the 1998 law. But we have a very important story to tell of how we got to our current position. Why did church teaching on religious freedom change at Vatican II? How did we move our institutions from that prevailing cultural norm before, that error has no rights, to today, where we are very, very vociferous and engaged advocates for religious freedom? This is an extremely important story we ought to be telling. Not just what our current ideas are on religious freedom, but how we got here. When Catholicism, the single largest religious denomination in the world, comes down in favor of religious freedom, how did we make that transition to believe that all human lives are sacred and have dignity, regardless of whether they are Catholic or not? These ideas are important not just because of the size of the church, and not just because of all the institutional outlets we have to promulgate those values, although those two things are extremely important as well. But the story of our own conversion on this point is important to tell, to try to persuade other groups who currently believe that religious repression is the only or the best option to secure the faith or to secure the state. How did the Catholic Church come to believe the opposite? How did we come to move in the opposite direction, to believe that religious repression was bad on its own merits, bad for both the church and the state? Those ideas, as painful as they may be to recall elements of the past, are important ideas that need telling. And I would submit that we should follow the example of Blessed John Paul II here, the second here, to be able to acknowledge the sins of past centuries, ask forgiveness from them, but use them as new moments to coalesce around new partnerships to move forward for peace. Finally, the third I, to move forward to Religious Freedom 2.0, the next generation of religious freedom policy, is where the third I, imagination and invitation, comes in. And we really need to let Jesus be our guide here. Throughout his life, Jesus consistently reached out to unlikely allies, to tax collectors, to prostitutes, to Samaritans and Romans and Gentiles. Not exactly people of like mind, and not exactly people of unquestioned moral caliber. The Catholic moral imagination about the centrality of communion, the power of community, the sacredness of all human life and dignity, that leads us to make these unexpected alliances with people who are not like us. It is what we did so well at the first generation at the start of this law and reaching out across political and religious borders, and it's what we need to do now to expand that sense of invitation. The two possible candidates that I suggest to you for unlikely allies are women's groups and security groups. The U.S. government and international organizations have many units that are currently working to expand women's and human rights and to expand international security. But these units do not work on or consider issues of international religious freedom. Often because of differences over pelvic or sexual issues, we do not work on areas where we have common ground in other areas with these groups. And unfortunately, too often in the polarized environment and the election environment we find ourselves in now, that people who do reach across ideological divides are too often branded as defectors or traitors, rather than hailed as doing Christ's work of building imaginative alliances and inviting others in who are not like us. So domestically, you'll hear more tomorrow, or the 13th at Georgetown University on these issues of religious freedom domestically. But too often this debate is parsed domestically, that one side charges a war on religious freedom and the other a war on women. But lost in this debate is the larger context, the larger international trajectory. Internationally, the war on religious freedom and the war on women is the same war. Religious freedom is violated and women suffer. And we need to look at what that might mean for unlikely coalition partners to move forward for the next generation of policy. The President and the Secretary of State are to be commended for working to advance women's leadership roles on these issues. For the first time ever, there is an international religious freedom ambassador within the State Department who is a woman, Suzanne Johnson Cook. For the first time ever, the director of the International Religious Freedom Office at the Department of State is a woman. The IRF Commission also now has a woman, female executive, Jackie Walcott, and a chair of the IRF Commission is also a woman. So it's an opportune time to use this new cadre of female leadership to work to build unlikely alliances between IRF advocates and women's rights advocates. Regarding security, I'll just say a moment and we'll close because so much has already been said that's been so rich in the breakout sessions on the security aspects of religious freedom. But religious freedom is a security concern. A majority of those places where the world's worst wars rage are countries that are among the worst violators of religious freedom. All of the top 5 least peaceful countries, a majority of the top 10 least peaceful countries are all the worst violators of religious freedom. And all of those on the top of the Global Peace Index are also countries with the best records of religious freedom. So we know that there are this correlation between religious freedom and security issues. And we also know that religious repression is an important early warning sign of conflict and violence to come in countries, a canary in the coal mine. And if you want, in the question and answer, I can say more about new evidence that shows religious repression laws actually cause violence rather than dispelling or reacting to it. So in conclusion, to build on the success that we had in the first generation of religious freedom advocacy, we have to see the woman's face and the security face of religious freedom and work accordingly to build new unlikely alliances and unlikely advocates. The Catholic moral and religious imagination offers us many fruitful principles and practices. Our sacraments of communion and reconciliation, our belief in a relational, triune, resurrected God, our institutional structures that seek to make these relationships real of local and global church, the body of Christ around the world, our preference for the poor, solidarity, subsidiarity. We regularly exercise moral muscles for the common good. And those are needed. That type of moral imagination is needed to protect international religious freedom and to save lives.
Thank you, Mary Ann. That was most enlightening and also provocative and stimulating. Thank you. She told me she was going to go 2 minutes over. You did 3. Sorry about that. Another dear friend of mine, John Carr, who has been involved in Catholic social teaching for 3 decades, has been the executive director and here at the USCCB, the Conference of Catholic Bishops, for we always change the titles, don't we, John? With human justice and and global development.
Good things.
Good things. Okay. John and I also have been friends a long, long time. I'm privileged to know him and to have worked with him. He is finishing up his time now at the USCCB, and he's accepted a position as resident fellow for this semester at the Kennedy School at Harvard, where he will be a fellow in the area of religion and politics, about which he knows more than most 10 people in this room. John, it's wonderful to have you here.
Well, yeah, it's great to be here, great to be back. Some of you don't even know I've left. Some of you are greatly reassured by the fact I've left. I feel a little bit like that commercial of the guy who says, you know, he's been given an impossible task, and he gets up in the morning and says, I can handle this. I've been at a Holiday Inn Express. Well, I've been at Harvard for 2 days. And I feel much smarter already. So far, I have an ID card and a gym membership. And those of you who know me know I will use one more than the other. Mary Ann offered a terrific look forward. I'm going to try and offer a look back. If she did Religious Freedom 2.0, I'm going to try and talk about the lessons of Religious Freedom 1.0. Because I think we've learned some things that will guide us. When you leave a place that you love and work that you love, you go through all your stuff. And as I was packing up, I found a little memento from the Lithuanian Priests Association. And it reminded me that while one of the last things I worked on before I left was this conference, one of the first things I worked on when I came to Bishops' Conference was our statement on religious freedom in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. And I remember a group of Lithuanian priests coming to visit me and explaining that if only the U.S. Catholic bishops would stand up and speak out for the church in Lithuania, things would change. And candidly, I was fairly skeptical. I had to find Lithuania on the map, and it wasn't on some maps. And I said, what are we talking about? They said, well, there are priests in jail simply for saying Mass. And I said, do you really think that if we started talking about this, that would change? This is the Soviet Union. This is the empire. They said if the Catholic Church in the United States stood up, it would change. And frankly, to move them along, I said, give us the name of 2 priests, not dozens. And we went to work. People in this room worked on this. And we talked to our government, we wrote, we talked to the Holy See. And about a year and a half later, I had the occasion to visit Lithuania with a delegation. And I met those 2 priests, and they were out of jail. And they said because the Church of the United States, along with the church around the world, had taken up their cause, they were now free to carry out their ministry and practice their faith. We can make a difference. We don't always make a difference. But there is a responsibility to try and make a difference. In those years, a lot has changed. Frankly, there's much more attention to religious liberty. Mary Ann talked about the passage of the law and all the structures that are in place, those 2 reports, and the obligation for every embassy in the world to have to assess religious freedom, for our foreign service officers to have to go around and talk to people. Candidly, one of the best parts of the act is the requirement for training for our foreign service officers. The State Department we have hired some people from the State Department. A couple are sitting here. Wonderful people. They tend to have a fairly secular, Ivy League, I can say that now, attitude. And they don't understand. I remember the ignorance about solidarity and the leadership of John Paul II and Lech Walesa. I worked for Cardinal Hickey, where I watched leaders of our government tell him that the women he sent to El Salvador were engaged in Marxist activity when they were really feeding the poor, and that the reason they had been killed by the regime was for political reasons, not for carrying out our faith. And so there are lots of things that are better. There's more knowledge, there's more experience, there's more documentation, but we have a lot more to do. Sadly, we have a lot more to do because there's a lot bigger problem in some places. As the bishop said, Christians are especially under fire, literally. And the horrific events of the last 24 hours, there are still people who will take life, who will use violence in order to, quote, defend their religion. And there are still, and that can never be justified, never excused, always condemned, and I hope the whole world will unite in that. And there is also people who take some pleasure in denigrating, ridiculing the faith of others, which is different but also needs to be condemned. The work of this conference goes on with new urgency, with new visibility. Our collaboration with the Holy See, frankly, is more regular. Our work with other bishops' conference, frankly, the internet and the web, we used to wait for faxes to come in overnight to see if we were going down the right path. And sadly, we have a fundamental challenge in our own situation, which has drawn our attention to religious liberty. When the federal government says that they will define what is a religious ministry, and in fact, that serving those who are not members of our faith or employing those who are not members of our faith to carry out those ministries means they are not religious ministries, we have a lot of work to do at home as well as abroad. But what I would like to do in the time remaining is just run through some of the lessons from Religious Freedom 1.0. First of all, religious freedom is real. It's literally a matter of life and death. It is, people die for what we take for granted. My mantra has been, we should never minimize it, nor exaggerate it. We should never turn our eyes away from the facts when people are paying for their practice of the faith, facing discrimination, facing persecution. We should not turn every dispute into a religious dispute. Some of these matters are tribal or economic or ethnic or political. And we should not lay a religious filter on everything. So it's real. Secondly, it's complicated. And we've talked about that complexity. Cuba is different than Nigeria, which is different from Iraq. When a government represses its people, denies people the right to live out their faith, that is one thing. When the government allows other groups in society to discriminate and go after people, that is different. When the government is incapable or unwilling to stop groups in society from hurting people because of their faith, those are all violations of religious freedom, but they're really different. And we can make mistakes. I was recently in the Holy Land, and over dinner talked to a young, brilliant Palestinian. And I said, you're everything this society needs. You're a Christian, you're smart, you're well-educated, you're raising a family. Why have you decided to stay? And he said, I'm probably not going to stay. My wife wants us to leave. And I said, why? And everybody has theory, the occupation, the Muslims, the economics. And most of us filter that through our own ideology. He said, well, I would want to stay because I really think the Palestinian state is important, but my wife and I are worried not what that Palestinian state will mean in the short term, but the long term. Will we be free as a minority? I say to my wife, I want to stay so that there will be Christians as well as Christian shrines. And she says, that's wonderful. Your children have never visited the Holy Sepulchre because they don't have the permits to do so. You want to show the faith, you can't practice your faith. And economically, the conflict, which has its roots in all the rest of this, left them vulnerable. So it's really complicated why people would choose to leave. Thirdly, we ought to listen, respect, and to respond to those who experience the problem. One of the best policies of the USCCB is we do everything we can to listen to those affected. Should something be said? Would it be counterproductive? What should be said? Who should say it? How should it be said? Where should it be said? I remember we have to make clear that the leaders of the church in other places speak for the church. Sometimes they want to work with us and not with the local leaders. Some history of that in Cuba. I remember visiting the Holy Land with Archbishop Roach. And we were not off the plane where the Religious Affairs Ministry was complaining about the Patriarch. And sort of had half the message. He stood up for Palestinians. He also worked for peace. And Archbishop Roach, with his usual diplomatic skills, said, when you go after him, you go after us. You really need to understand that. He represents us here. Don't complain to us about him. He is us. Now, sometimes that bluntness can be unproductive, but we need to support and stand with the church in those lands. We need to defend the religious freedom of all and not forget about our own and not tip either way on that balance. Our credibility depends on standing up for the religious freedom of all. Our solidarity depends on standing up for our brothers and sisters in our own faith. Cardinal McCarrick testified before, I believe it was the House, in defense of the rights of Muslims. And he did so. And then he said, their struggles mirror our struggles in other places, and we need to stand together. Relationships matter. Relationships give us knowledge, they give us passion, they put a face on the problem. I have been on a number of these solidarity visits and where we have visited the church that is suffering repression and discrimination. I once described a bishop's solidarity visit as a family vacation without the fun. It is very demanding. It is not a junket. But out of that comes a passion and a knowledge and a sense that people are not alone. Relationships matter in the public arena. Dennis McDonough, leading advisor to the president on foreign affairs, coming this afternoon on a very busy day. I hope he's still coming. Because of a relationship, because he sits down with our bishops' committee. When East Timor was in flames, when the Indonesians were burning down the cathedral and had killed Caritas workers and had macheted one of our bishops and were probably going to kill Bishop Bello, Cardinal McCarrick called the First Lady, Mrs. Clinton, and said, this can't go on. And she sent him to Richard Holbrooke, who he had met. And he said, we need to stand up. And they sent him to some military general we had worked with on landmines. Cardinal McCarrick builds bridges, tears down walls. That's good advice for all of us. Because of that effort, the U.S. changed its policy, literally overnight, and a peacekeeping mission of Australians was permitted to go to East Timor. Relationships matter. A crisis is not a moment to try and build a relationship. So we work very closely to stay in touch with the religious freedom structures of our government. Modesty becomes us. I think I'm on number 6. Okay. You and I ought to work together more. And this is the point Marianne made. We're relatively new to this commitment to religious freedom. I remember telling Louis Wyman, my Lutheran friend in the second grade, that he was a wonderful person. It was a shame he was going to hell. And his mother called my mother and said this was not the best way to move ahead. And my mother, I said, that's what Sister told me. And she said Sister was wrong. It's the only time she ever said that. But we're relatively new to this, and we ought to be clear about that. It's been made plain. The other reality is our nation has some history. I live in Maryland. Saudi Arabia is not the only place where it's a crime to say Mass. That was Maryland decades ago. We have our own conflicts. We have our own struggles. We're in court today trying to defend our rights. So a little modesty. Watch out for the self-righteousness. Number 7, practice solidarity and demand reciprocity. Build up the unity of the religious community. David Saperstein is here. Saeed is here from the Muslim community. Our friends in the evangelical community, Galen Carey is here. Many others are here. We have worked together to build not a coalition, but a common religious witness for the religious freedom of all. And we stand together for all, and we talk candidly to each other where there are shortcomings, when they need to stand up for us. On the Nazareth Mosque, which became a symbol of trouble for Christians in the Holy Land, we made our appeals. We talked to the White House. We talked to the Israeli embassy. I think it was our Jewish friends who persuaded the Israeli government to intervene in that case. It is relationships, it is reciprocity that matters. Number 8, dialogue is essential. If we're going to get to Religious Freedom 2.0, we have to move beyond where we are, and we have to show the respect for other traditions. We have to talk about the hard things. Dialogue cannot be simply a celebration of what we agree on, but difficult conversations about difficult topics. When we worked in Northern Ireland, it was the Presbyterians who worked for equality for Catholics that made a difference, and that was the result of dialogue. Number 9, beware of trying to push our religious freedom agenda into our own ideological, political, or geopolitical framework. I remember when we were working with conservatives on Vietnam and China and Cuba, and with liberals on Central America and the Holy Land. We need to be consistent. We need to help others be consistent so that we're not dealing with double standards in terms of our political friends and adversaries. We need to look, number 10, I guess, we need to look for leverage. One of the things we did, and it was controversial at the time, was the Bishops' Conference opposed most favored nation status for China because of human rights and religious freedom. There never was a moment that we had a chance of defeating most favored nation status for China. But working with a diverse coalition from Nancy Pelosi to Frank Wolf, Henry Hyde to Dennis Kucinich, every year when it came forward, we would say, what about the treatment of Christians, of Buddhists, of others in China? And I will never forget this. The head of the China-U.S. Trade Commission came to meet with our committee, and he made the case for why those relationships were really important. And then he said quietly afterwards, I'm a Catholic. Thank you for doing this. Every time I go to China, I say, you know, they're watching what you do on religious freedom. You know, our biggest problem in the Congress is the way you treat Christians and Buddhists. You know, this has to get better or we're going to be in trouble. Without that witness, there would have been no opportunity to raise that issue. Now, I think he was comforted by the fact that we were never going to prevail. Don't underestimate small gestures and actions. Cardinal Dolan talked about the letters he signs, and those can get pro forma terribly. There are murders of priests and sisters. There are bombings of churches. There are terrible incidents that happen. And each time our chairman or our president writes a letter and says, the church in the United States stands with you. And you can get jaded about that. I've been there when they've read those letters at those moments. And the fact that the church in the United States stands with them means the world to them at that point. Don't overpromise or create expectations. Some of these stories are really old. I remember when I worked for the conference a long time ago, they went in to see President Carter on Central America. And before the bishops went in, we got a call from the church in Lebanon. And it turns out the Israelis were shelling the wrong village. It was a Christian village, not complicated. So at the end of the meeting where they talked about Archbishop Romero and this and that, they said, is there anything else you want to talk about? And they said, well, we're not sure, but we have this report that this Christian village in Lebanon is being shelled. And the president turned to his national security advisor, Brzezinski, and said, what do we know about this? And he said, well, we don't know, but we'll check. Well, about an hour later, the shelling stopped. And the leadership of the church in Lebanon took from that we met every day at noon with the President of the United States. And he asked us what was the problem, you know. Do not overpromise and do not create expectations which can't be filled. And then finally, do not confuse real persecution with other disputes. Do not overgeneralize. People have been saying terrible things for a long time about Catholics because of what some Catholics do. And now these days, people are saying terrible things about Muslims because of what some Muslims do. We ought to be one of the communities that makes clear that when people misuse or abuse faith for violence, for terrible things, it is they that are wrong, not their faith that is wrong. We can talk later about what we need to do in the task ahead. I think Marianne has laid it out. I would say two things. Put a face on the problem. Those visits, that priest in that sanctuary in Lithuania is someone I will never forget. People ought to know that there are people risking their lives for what we take for granted every weekend. And one way to do that is by the wonderful work of CRS and MRS in terms of refugees and other victims of oppression. Put a face on the problem and then give us handles. I no longer work at the Bishops' Conference. I'm not going to be a part of these processes. What I want to know is what can I do as one Catholic, as one person? Who do I write? What do I say? How can I express my solidarity? And we ought to provide tools for that. Let me close with one last story. When Lech Walesa was elected president of Poland, he came to Washington, and everybody wanted to see him. And so we didn't even ask for a visit, but he called, and he asked if he could have Mass at the Bishops' Conference. And I'll never forget it. It was a gray November day. We had Mass in our chapel. We had breakfast. I've never had Polish sausage and onions for breakfast before or since. And here was this little guy. I don't know what a Polish electrician looks like, but he looked like a Polish electrician. And he said, I want to thank every bishop, every Catholic in the United States for your support of solidarity. And I was one of the people supposed to respond. I said, Mr. President, everyone supported solidarity. Your cause was just, your leadership was inspiring. We all supported solidarity. And he goes, no, he said. In the beginning, when it made all the difference, the only thing we could count on was the Catholic Church and the labor movement. And that made all the difference. So here was this guy who changed not just his factory, not just his town, not even just his country. It changed the world without a pane of glass being broken, as he pointed out, who came to thank us for our support. So I left that session with some pride. I went back to my office, and the phone rang, and it was a voice I didn't recognize, an accent I have trouble understanding. And the person says they've killed 6 priests and the women who worked with them. And it was the terrible story of the murder of the Jesuits in El Salvador. And this person says, you have to call the embassy, you have to call the Congress, you have to call the White House, you have to call the wire services. And I said, wait, wouldn't it be better if we helped you tell this terrible story? And again, he said, no. He said, because of where you are, because of who you are, because of the power of your government, what you do about this is more important than what we do. Now, I do not believe that is true. I think there is greater measure of peace and justice in El Salvador because of what the church and people of El Salvador has done. But they had a point. Because we are citizens of a powerful democracy, because our government has so much influence in the world, we bear a special responsibility. Nobody is going to give us the Nobel Prize like Lech Walesa. Nobody's going to come onto this campus and shoot the faculty like they did the Jesuits. But each of us in our own way, as a bishop, as an academic, as a policymaker, or now as just an ordinary Catholic, we have to do what we can to defend the life and dignity and freedom of every believer on this earth. Thank you.
I can give testimony that everything that John told us, and I'm very, very grateful, we all are very grateful to you, John, everything that John told us, he lives. So thank you for both for your witness and for your words. We have about 20 minutes left, and I would ask you to be brief and in your questions and observations. In fact, let's try to make them questions. Observations tend to get a little bit long. And what do we have? Do you want to help me with this? Thanks, Professor. And so if you just raise your hand, and we'll try to get as many questions in as possible. And who would like to start off? Bishop Boland right over here, and then let me see. We'll have someone ready for the next one. Go ahead.
Mariana is fascinated that sea change that took place within the church of becoming proactive in religious freedom. What was the rationale for that, or what brought it about?
Thank you. Marianne or John, either one. Oh, you need a mic.
I would just say I think there are people in this room far better poised to speak to that issue who were likely there as the discussions were held. But I think that we're often reluctant to talk about the, quote, dirty laundry, that we didn't used to be a voice in favor of religious freedom, and now we are. And I think that's precisely the story that needs to be told, because that's the persuasive argument, for how the church came to really, not just on religious freedom, but also in relation to democracy. It's a very important transition for how we came to have a different view of modernity and our role in modern life versus before. And I think reluctance to talk about it doesn't help move it forward.
Well, just while Archbishop Wenski is, I think one thing that's worth talking about is how that came about. I mean, who were the people in the church that laid the groundwork for that? I think of John Courtney Murray in this country, but others. Our credibility depends. I mean, the Crusades were not a movie. It was Cardinal George who, on the floor of the Bishops' Conference, said, before we celebrate Thomas More as a champion of religious freedom, he did remarkable things in resisting the power of the king, but he also put some people to death for having the wrong religion. I think by, as Marianne said, not only by acknowledging our mistakes, But talking about the process that led to the church understanding the gospel in a way that allowed us to stand up for the religious freedom of all is a good thing, because frankly, there are other communities that need to make that journey.
You spoke about the unlikely or surprising coalitions. However, it seems that just like in this country, religious freedom is being threatened because of the current cultural wars, gay rights, and women pro-choice, pro-abortion advocates are opposing our efforts to maintain our religious freedom, because our religious freedom, in their view, is an obstacle to their emancipation, if you will. And this is also, I think, a factor in the international sphere. I think some of the same debates that are going on, or that went on, for example, in Cairo several years ago, or even now in Geneva, pits the rights of believers for religious freedom against the supposed rights of people that are advocating a redefinition of the understanding of marriage, or to assert their rights over the unborn. So, I'd like you. So I'm a little bit less hopeful as the possibilities of really forging those unlikely coalitions, because I think they're already on the other side.
I call them unlikely for a reason. But I think that's where we need to push the envelope, because in any kind of peace building effort, whether it's in religious freedom or others, how do you see people who had formerly been viewed as enemies as possibly not? And so that's, I think, the challenge. There's going to be areas where we absolutely have disagreements, but can we find any areas of common ground to work together and not cast large groups of the population as enemies? And when you're talking about women, you can't make peace with 50% of the population absent from that equation. And you can't push the religious freedom agenda forward without the support of 50% of the population. So rather than looking at it merely as the struggles on this one subset of issues, but looking at the vast possibility and capacity that are opened when we look in new ways at these issues. So it's absolutely not easy, and there may be many places in which it turns out to be mission impossible. But I think we have the responsibility to try to expand these alliances and think creatively in new ways, and not write off groups because of our disagreements on other issue areas. But absolutely difficult, hard, but worth trying.
Thank you for both wonderful talks. I want to support what you said about needing to work with women, and let me tell you very briefly a story. When I was privileged to introduce a method of natural family planning in Kenya, in a Kikuyu parish, which was very patriarchal, a year later, I was hearing very interesting stories. And what it amounted to is that women had been raised to the level of equal partnership in the marriage. They were sharing in the decision-making, where to send the kids to school and so forth. And I wondered what had happened. It occurred to me that the husbands had to learn to respect their wives' bodies. You can't respect somebody's body without respecting their person. And it worked. And for Catholics, there is that little notion of the incarnation and the value of the body. I would suggest we start working with the experience, person outreach, very much like JP2,
Not a question, but an observation on the question about how did we come around to begin to become champions of religious freedom. My personal experience in the area of dialogue with, especially with Islam, which is the religion we have in Nigeria, is that it dawned on me the great revolution that Vatican II was, Lumen Gentium, which extended the realm of the people of God to include everybody who are generally honest with God, thereby embracing my own ancestors, whom we have been considering as pagans and heathens and whatever. And when we add that to the document on religious freedom, which, as you know, didn't have an easy passing, we now realize that the church really did make a change in the theological understanding. And when I explained that to some of my other Christians in Nigeria, one of them actually told me, if this is what you Catholics believe now, then I don't think you are Christians. How can you say that Muslims worship the true God? You know, in other words, we now take it for granted. Most of us here, I studied theology in Rome in 1965. That's the year the council finished. So I was trained, I learned Vatican II documents. Maybe those who went before me learned other things. But now we take it for granted that if you're a good Catholic, if you're a good Catholic bishop, you must believe Vatican II. You must know that every religion must be respected. You must even believe, as far as Islam is concerned, that we have the same God. But you shouldn't take it for granted. There are many Christians out there who don't believe it, who tell me that Muslims worship one idol in Saudi Arabia called Allah. And it cannot be the same God as the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And when I remember that, and that is what makes it possible for all of us in our own bishops' conference to speak with one voice, which is not possible with many of my Protestant colleagues, then we can really thank God for what Vatican II has done for us. And it's opened up possibilities. I'm aware that in the area of dialogue, even among Muslims too, there are those who don't believe that there can be any good outside of Islam. So we have to take all that in our stride.
Joan Desmond, National Catholic Register. There's been a reference to the Cold War period when religious freedom in Poland, and of course there was a Refusnik effort as well in the former Soviet Union. How would you compare those kinds of issues that were addressed at that period with today? Just very briefly sketch out some similarities and differences between religious freedom issues of that era and now.
Well, some of them are the same with regard to China, where you have a state looking to repress practice of religion writ large and concerns in that regard. But even China is much more open now than I think the Soviet Union was at the height of the Cold War, and is seeing the values in which religious organizations can provide in social services, et cetera. So even that's not a perfect analogy. But I think what you often have today is states not wanting to abolish all religion and abolish the practice of religion as the former Soviet Union did, but states that want to create a particular form of religion as the state religion. And that is, more often the flavor of religious freedom problems that we're seeing around the world. But there's nearly 200 countries. You can't make generalizations about them all. But I would say the totalitarian model of abolishing religion is less the model that we see today.
This is something Bishop Murphy knows more about than I do. Part of it is that in that period it was the power of the state that was the force of repression. The state feared faith. In this case, I think there are some places where the state is in fear of the power of the religious majority. And so you find states in the Arab world moving towards more public expression of Muslim law under pressure from religious figures and from people, as opposed to imposing Sharia law or Muslim objectives on the whole population. There are more opportunities. I think I had the experience. It was Georgetown that invited me to talk to folks who were part of the Religious Affairs Ministry of China. And my first thought was, I don't want this reported to those of you. I mean, these guys are the problems. You know, they're the ones watching, checking up, trying to dictate bishops. But the invitation I had was not to talk about the life of the church in China, but to talk about the life of the church in the United States, and particularly the way in which the church made a contribution to the common good through our human services and social justice advocacy. And because I wasn't a cleric, I wasn't a bishop, I thought I could probably go. And by simply doing two things. One was talk about the good that is done in the name of religion, and secondly, expressing my complete and utter bewilderment about a system where the state would appoint bishops, without arguing the case, frankly, just saying I can't imagine how that would work. And literally afterwards, a couple of these functionaries of the Chinese government, Jenny was there, came up and said, well, how are your bishops chosen? I said, well, the church chooses the bishops, not the state. Well, that had never occurred to them as a possibility. So part of what is to take the limited opportunities we have for dialogue and engagement to help people understand our view of faith, its assets, its contributions to the common good. And I think some of the people who are doing the most important work on religious freedom are those engaged in genuine religious dialogue that is not superficial, is not, can't we all, reason together, but is trying to deal in real terms with some of the issues that the Archbishop described.
One last thing on this, if I might. So in the Cold War, you had strong states repressing religion. Now you still have that model in some places, but you also have the model of weak states either unable to stop religious repression that's being caused by cultural groups within society, or weak states which the competition is over control of that the religious group wants to be the state. And the last thing I want to say in this regard is one of the arguments you often hear when governments impose new religious repression laws is that they have to do this because they can't control the groups in their own society, and there will be a bloodletting if they don't have these more repressive laws against conversion or et cetera. And therefore, they need to do this for the good of the people so that there won't be a bloodletting. But there's new research on this that actually tracks what happens when governments put in some of these blasphemy and repression laws in the name of that this will stop the bloodletting among cultural groups who are doing the repression, and the state is helpless to stop it. And it actually shows the opposite, that prior to the imposition of these laws, there is not much violence or conflict among the cultural groups. And then after the imposition of these laws, as we all suspect, it's like a red flag, the state saying these are groups that are minority groups that are imperiled, that we're not fully supportive of, and there's a target over their head now. So the rationale often given is the weakness of the state means that we have to do this, but often the actual result is the opposite.
Could I say we need to just have one last question, Steve? Can you get someone for us? The microphone is right here. Thank you.
It's actually a comment rather than a question. It was in favor of your good points about finding sometimes unlikely bedfellows. And I had the honor to serve with the Holy See at Cairo, and one of the things that we were able to do is point to the commonalities that we had with many of the, interestingly, more with the Islamic countries than even with the Christian countries, because politics tended to get more in the way in the Christian. But the Islamic, once we started talking about pro-life and pro-family, we were able to form a coalition that really blocked the progress of the international attempt to have an international right to abortion. So just that. Thank you.
Well, just one last story about seizing your opportunities and not underestimating the thirst for freedom. One of the first trips I ever went on, Cardinal McCarrick was there, then Archbishop Mahoney and Archbishop O'Mara. We were the first group in to Vietnam after the war, and we stayed in government guest houses. We were followed by people from the Religious Affairs Ministry. We assumed everything we said, everyone we met with, was recorded. But I don't know if it was Cardinal McCarrick or Cardinal Mahoney who had this great idea that we would go into the library of the government guest house and we would rehearse what we were going to tell the government officials about our concern for the priests in jail and the people under fire because of their faith, on the assumption that the tapes of that would be analyzed with much greater thoroughness than the meetings that we actually had. And there was one guy, there was two people who followed us around, and one guy seemed to be a very tough guy. And at the very end of the visit, he took me aside and said, "I'm a believer, and I want to get out of here." And this was a trusted member of the Religious Affairs Ministry. And he said, anything you can do. So here was someone who had been screened and tested and checked and probably reported everything we had said. And at the one moment of confidentiality he had, he said, "I believe and I want to escape so we can live in freedom." So my advice is seize whatever opportunity they have. Whenever they're going to listen to you, tell them. And never underestimate the desire of the human person for freedom.
Just in moving from Religious Freedom 1.0 to Religious Freedom 2.0, just to think that the status quo is not self-sustaining, and neither are relationships. So how are we going to build new relationships, and how are we going to shore up the old ones to move that forward? It's difficult work, it's frustrating work, but it's necessary work, and lives depend on it.
Well, thank you both very, very much. And I could just say, by way of conclusion, that it seems to me that if all of us could have your 14 points, John, as part of our own baggage that we carry with us, then I think we'd all be well prepared to move into the three I's of Marianne, of ideas, imagination, and information. Could I tell one last story? Well, this one has to do with Cuba, and this is Archbishop Wensky knows this better than I, but from time to time in my past, I would be going to Cuba with a couple of others before I was a bishop. And we were there one time with a cardinal, a bishop, and myself meeting with Fidel Castro. And we had a short meeting of 5 hours. And during that period, the President Castro wanted to ask questions about theology and human rights and what was the theology of human rights and how do we see it. And so the Cardinal said, "Well, Monsignor Murphy will answer those." So I said, "Thank you very much." And I did my best. And then that evening, we were having dinner with all the Cuban bishops at the Nunciature, and Fidel Castro came to greet us at the end. And he was very, very gracious to us all, went around the table, greeted each one, and he got to me and he said, "Oh, mira, es mi teólogo. Look, here's my theologian." And I looked at him and I said, "Please don't ever tell the Holy Father that." Now, it's 6 o'clock. We have a 15-minute break, and I'm to tell you to be back here at 6:15 sharp, because Deputy National Security Advisor Dennis McDonough and our own Dr. Thomas Farr, our good friend, will be here for the final panel gathering. Did I say that correctly? So thank you all for your attention. Thank you all for your participation.